Hey guys, what's up? MadSeason here, back with another video for you. I got a new series for you where I take a look at features or things that were in the game but have since been removed for one reason or another. I discuss the good and bad things about them, explain why they were removed, and compare them with what we have now. In this video, I want to talk about the old school talent system and class specializations. Before we begin though, let's take a look at what we have now so we can get a good basis for comparison. You're all familiar with the current system. Each class has 3 specializations, or specs for short. You first pick one upon reaching level 10, and anytime after that, you can switch between them freely. Each one gives you a very different playstyle and certain abilities. Some of these are called core abilities, and you get them with every spec, such as Frost Nova or Polymorph for Mage. And other abilities are locked to certain specs only. For example, Frostbolt is only available to Frost spec. And for each of these specializations, you also have unique talent trees that improve your abilities. It depends on the class, but for most of them, you get a choice of one of 3 talents every 15 levels up to 90. Some classes, such as the Death Knight and Demon Hunter, have theirs distributed differently due to them starting off at a higher level. As I said, 3 choices per tier. Some tiers focus on defense, some on utility, and others on damage. And they're meant to provide an even increase, so the choice isn't so clear-cut. They're designed to be substantial, but if 2 people pick different ones, the power difference between them isn't substantial. Once again, by design anyways. This was all implemented during the Cataclysm expansion, and for the most part it's worked pretty well. There are some issues with it that I'll go over later, but first let's go back in time and look at the old talents. Specializations still of course existed back in the day, but they weren't as clear cut as they are now. You didn't choose a spec and were given a singular talent tree for that spec. Instead, upon reaching level 10, you unlocked every talent tree for your class and 1 talent point. You could put this talent point into the first row of talents of any of the 3 specs, and this would be the way that you shape and customize your playstyle. You progress down the trees kind of similar to how you do it now, in the sense that it's tier based. As I said, the first row of talents is always available, but to get a talent in the second row, you would first need to invest 5 points in any of the talents in that specialization. And to put a point in the third row talent, you would need 10 points spent in that spec total, and so on. And some talents also required you to put points into a certain prerequisite. The talents themselves were much more minor in general, providing small percentage increases to certain abilities, more crit, hit, etc. You did still have abilities, but they were typically far down in the tree near the bottom. This makes sense though, since in vanilla at least, he had 51 points to put in, so some of them had to be minor like that. There were good things and bad things with this system. I won't say if they're better or worse because it's a subjective thing. So I'll just go over the pros and cons and let you decide. So let's talk about the good first. One of the biggest pluses I think is that it gave you more investment with your character. Each level gave you a talent point, and even if some were just small percentage increases, it was something you looked forward to. Similar to how it is now, but for every level instead of every 15. Each level, you felt your character was evolving to what you wanted them to be endgame, and the choices were pretty hard, mainly because they weren't so easily reversible as they are now. Each pick made you think a lot, like this one is a good damage boost, but this other one can be good for PvP. How often will I PvP? What will I do in it? Run flags, kill players, etc. It was something I'd mull over while on a flight path or walking to my next quest. A decision that was being weighed for the entirety of the level building up to it. Another plus was just the freedom of choices. This was back when hybrid specs still existed. For example, as a mage, you of course had a choice between fire, frost, and arcane. You could put a majority of your points into any of those specs if you want, but you could also say, instead of being a strong fire mage, I want to be a little skilled at all 3, fire, frost, and arcane. And it was true for any class. You could be a 2-handed DPS warrior, but still be capable of saving the day with some protection talents, so you could put on a sword and shield if your tank died or something. It was far less restrictive than what we have today, with fire spells only being available to fire mages, and defensive abilities for warrior being locked into protection, and so on. But like I said, it did have its bad sides. The biggest one, and the reason why it was changed, was that although you could put points into wherever you wanted to, if you were serious about endgame, there were basically 1 or 2 specs that were considered quote-unquote the best. So, for those who wanted to raid, wanted to min-max their character, either in PvE or PvP, that freedom of choice was really just an illusion. Once everyone started to figure out the best possible choices, everyone basically had the same talent trees. You could deviate a little, maybe 5 points here and there, but that was about it. And with how minor some of the talents were, it was a pretty insignificant deviation. So this talent system, which had nearly 100 different talents across all 3 specs by the time Wrath of the Lich King rolled around, boiled down to a couple of choices for each spec. Another issue, and this isn't really as big, nor was it tied to the talent system specifically, was that, like I mentioned earlier, you better think hard about where you spend your points because it was rough to change it. Back in vanilla, the cost of clearing all of your talents got more and more expensive the more you did it, capping out at 50 gold. That was a lot back then. Most people were running around with 100 to 200 gold in their pockets, so burning 50 on a respec was a big deal. Barring the rage that came from accidentally clicking the wrong talent, the problem that arose from this is, like I said, you had specs that were good for PvE and PvP. So, while you could technically do both whenever you wanted to, you would be pretty heavily underpowered if you engage in the activity that you weren't spec'd for. And the same went for wanting to switch roles. Maybe your guild was short on tanks one night, or your friends wanted to run a dungeon but had no tank. Being a warrior, you could respec and go protection, but would you really want to burn 100 gold to switch specs twice? It was still restrictive, but just in a different way it is now. It was later addressed with the dual talent specialization that came in a Wrath of the Lich King patch, but it was still very expensive to unlock, costing 1000 gold. And still, it was only just 2 specs. I remember this feature was one of the biggest requests, and when it came, triple talent specialization was one of the biggest requests. Like I mentioned, this trouble really isn't tied to just the talent tree system. It's easily fixed by lowering the respec cost, but we're talking about how it was, not what it could have been. And it was a valid issue back then, particularly during the vanilla portion of the game. Another issue was that, over time, it was just becoming too much. The talent trees got longer and longer with each expansion due to the level cap increase, and more talents were being added, making it more difficult to balance. If we kept with it today, we would have 101 talent points to spend, with probably around 200 talents across all 3 specs. Their thought process was that it eventually gets to a point to where it becomes too messy and it would only get worse as expansions are rolled out. One might say that things are much cleaner now, both with talents and abilities. A lot of old abilities that you rarely used were either removed or moved to their appropriate spec. Some might say that this is a good thing, and others might say it's a bad thing. One thing you can say though is that it's definitely easier to balance, and while we're on that subject, let's talk about the current talent system. So, the balance was really tricky with the old system, and you eventually just ended up with 1 or 2 paths for your preferred spec. I'd say it's a little improved now, although far from ideal. In general, the choices aren't as clear-cut as they used to be. If you use websites such as Icy Veins, depending on your class of course, you typically have some tiers where at least 2 choices are viable. Either for rating or Mythic Plus, you can alter your playstyle a bit, even changing talents for certain bosses if you want, and you have a lot more freedom in that regard. Being able to switch specializations freely is a really nice thing too, and with gear changing stats when you do that, it's not out of the question to be able to maintain 2 specs. Although, you gotta admit that the way they have artifacts and legendary set up makes it less than ideal. So overall, the talent and spec system today is much more simple and convenient to use, and whether someone takes this as a good thing or a bad thing is going to depend on the person. If you just present these 2 systems as in-depth and complicated versus simple and convenient, without any frame of reference, these days most people are going to say the simple and convenient system is superior, but I think people who prefer the opposite bring up a good point. There's a certain appeal in the complexity and open-endedness to it, and I think it's one of the bigger things behind the vanilla versus current game argument you see nowadays. The classic example I always bring up is the Elder Scrolls series. In the 3rd game of the series, Morrowind, aside from the main story, you of course had several side quests and objectives you could complete, and to figure out how to do them, you had to explore, ask around town, etc., and your character would mark down important notes in your journal, and that's all you had. Even figuring out where to go was a journey itself. The next game, Oblivion, was the first in the series to introduce waypoints, straight up telling you exactly where to go. It was convenient, yes, but you lost a big aspect to the game. You could still use the journal if you wanted to and ignore the waypoints, but in the next one, Skyrim, the journal was demoted to a short list of simple instructions and footnotes, a shadow of what it used to be in Morrowind. I think you can draw a similar comparison to the talents and specializations in World of Warcraft. It's complexity versus simplicity. Now, having used both systems, I personally prefer the current way they have it set up, but I think that people shouldn't be too quick to dismiss the old system because it had some important aspects to it. It wasn't perfect, but neither is the current system, I think. Personally, I think obtaining a perfect balance in the game is an illusion, so no system will ever be perfect. I mean, if they haven't done it in 12 plus years, I don't think it's going to happen. Anyways, that's the old talent system and how they compare to what we have now. Hopefully, I didn't go too off track with this, but it's a subject I'm passionate about as you can probably tell, so I can get a little ranty. I hope it didn't get in the way of you enjoying the video, and let me know if you want to see more stuff like this. This video is probably susceptible to the vanilla versus live debate. You guys can do whatever you want since I don't moderate comments, but I just want to say that it wasn't the point of the video. I just wanted to reminisce a bit and show you something that you maybe haven't seen yet and hopefully entertain you. I think both versions of the game are good in their own different ways, and they're too different now to be compared to one another. The game has changed so much over the past 12 or so years, it's crazy. But that's all I have to talk about. I hope you found the video interesting. Like it if you liked it, and thanks for watching. Peace.